Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar. The topic of this webinar is Improving Air Quality with Energy Storage, a new deployment strategy for public health and environmental equity. This webinar is a presentation of Clean Energy Group's Resilient Power Project, and the host for this webinar is Resilient Power Project Director Seth Mullendore. We have a couple of excellent guest speakers with us today. Before I pass it over to them, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes with everyone. All of our participants for this webinar are in listen-only mode. That means that hopefully you can hear us, but we can't hear you. You have a couple of options to join the audio portion of this webinar. You can either call in using your telephone, or you can connect using your computer, mic, and speakers. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions as you think of them throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on your webinar console and hitting send. We will be reading through your questions as they come in, and we will save some time at the end of our presentations to have a Q&A with the audience. We'll get to as many questions as we can, but it is important that you type them in sooner rather than later. It just gives you a better chance that we will get to your question because we usually get a flood of questions at the end. So do type those in as you think of them. A final note, this webinar is being recorded. You will find a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous Resilient Power Project webinars on our website at resilient-power.org, and we will also send you a follow-up email within about 24 hours with a link to the recording of this webinar as well as the webinar slides. And with that, I would like to pass it over to our host for this webinar, Seth Mullendore.
Thank you very much, Sam, and thank you to everyone joining us today. I think it's going to be a really great webinar, and we're excited to have folks from PSE Healthy Energy joining us to speak today. I wanted to give you a brief introduction about who we are at Clean Energy Group and the Resilient Power Project. So Clean Energy Group is a national nonprofit. It's been around for about 20 years. Works in all sectors of clean energy and bringing innovative technologies to the forefront through innovative in finance, technology, and policy. We also have a sister organization called the Clean Energy States Alliance, which is a membership organization of state energy organizations that deal with clean energy and manage clean energy programs. Resilient Power Project is a joint project with the Meridian Institute. It's completely foundation funded. We have a number of our foundations listed here. And just to let you know a bit about what the Resilient Power Project is, which is bringing you this webinar today. Resilient Power Project has been around for about 3 years, really came in the wake of Superstorm Sandy. A lot of people were left without power in the Northeast, and a lot of people either had no backup generation or were in areas where diesel generators failed for a variety of reasons. A lot of the affected communities were critical infrastructure and public housing, low-income residents were hit the hardest during this disaster. So we looked for a better alternative, a cleaner alternative to traditional generators, and really came to the solution of solar combined with battery storage. The costs of both technologies have been on a rapid decline, and they're more and more feasible for a variety of facilities. We really have expanded our definition of resiliency over the project, both in traditional backup power and also providing economic resiliency for communities, so lowering the cost of energy and making it more affordable for residents and property owners. We have a focus on low-income communities and really work a lot in affordable housing, as well as I said, critical public facilities that are located and support these communities, such as healthcare facilities, emergency response centers, community shelters, and things of that nature. In addition to working to develop projects and get projects done, we put out a lot of information and reports and blogs to raise awareness of solar and storage for resiliency, and also work with policymakers on a variety of levels, from federal to state to community leaders. And as I said, we're looking to get individual projects done. So we work with project developers on an individual level and do provide some technical assistance support, both through the technical assistance that we can do on a high level ourselves and providing some grant support to certain projects to do pre-development analysis of technical and financial feasibility. If you're interested in learning more about the Resilient Power Project, I urge you to check out our website, resilient-power.org. It has a number of reports that we put out, a newsletter, and announcements about webinar recordings such as this. So next slide will show you just a screenshot of the web page. And as I said, I urge you to check that out. It has resources for people looking to develop a resilient power project or just learn more, including featured installations and a checklist for new project developers. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists for today. They're both joining us from PSE Healthy Energy. We have Dr. Seth Shonkoff. Dr. Shonkoff is the Executive Director of the Energy Science and Policy Organization, PSE Healthy Energy. He is also a visiting scholar in the Department of Environmental Science, Policy, and Management at UC Berkeley, and an affiliate in the Environment Energy Technology Division at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He is an environmental and public health scientist by training with more than 15 years of experience in water, air, climate, and population health research. Seth holds a PhD in environmental science and policy with an MPH in epidemiology from UC Berkeley. We're also joined by Dr. Elena Krieger. Dr. Krieger is Director of the Clean Energy Program at PSE Healthy Energy. Her work focuses on accelerating transition to clean energy on a path that realizes the health, environmental, equity, and resilience benefits of this transition. Most recently, she's worked on analysis of the Clean Power Plan in Ohio and in Pennsylvania. Elena holds a PhD in mechanical and aerospace engineering from Princeton, where her research focused on energy storage for renewables. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers for today, and again, urge you to enter questions as you have them, and we'll get to those at the end.
Hello, everyone. My name is Seth Shonkoff, and thank you very much for having us. So today, we're going to be, again, speaking about improving air quality with energy storage, a new deployment strategy for public health and environmental equity. This is all based on a paper that we recently published in Energy Policy. Sorry about that, a little technical difficulty. So the way that we're going to structure this is basically I'm going to introduce who we are, and then I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Krieger, who's going to deliver the vast majority of this presentation. So for those that don't know about us, PSE Healthy Energy is an energy science and policy institute. And at the highest level, what we aim to do is bring scientific transparency to different energy policies and energy choices. We're located in New York and California, and among a variety of topics that we work on, we conduct research on clean energy transitions, looking through the lenses of health and environmental impacts. We also have a robust oil and gas program looking through similar lenses. And in a lot of ways, we function as a, very similar to a university shop. We identify data gaps, especially those that challenge the progression of more responsible policies in this arena. But then unlike a university shop, we spend a good amount of time and effort translating science from English to English into forms that can be easily integrated into the platforms of those that are making decisions, as well as those that are working with policymakers to make more responsible decisions. So with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Krieger.
Thanks, Seth. So today, as we have now said a couple of times, we're going to be talking about a study that we published in July in the journal Energy Policy, which has the admittedly unwieldy title of A Framework for Siting and Dispatch of Emerging Energy Resources to Realize Environmental and Health Benefits, Case Study on Peaker Power Plant Displacement. Next time we are going to engage Seth Mullendore with any help to help us title our papers. Why did we get into this in the first place? As many of you guys certainly know, we were excited with everyone else to see the rapid growth and deployment of energy storage demand response and solar that are taking off across the country, particularly in California. These technologies are ostensibly being put on the grid for environmental and health and equity reasons. That's why we have a lot of these storage targets. But one of the things that we noticed is that a lot of these benefits are not actually really being realized or as realized to the potential that they could be. There are a lot of policy and regulatory efforts right now. We see this in California and New York, focused on how do we value these new technologies on the grid. What is storage worth? Where and when do we operate it to get that value out of it? But unfortunately, all of these conversations seem to be focused primarily on the directly monetizable grid benefits of those technologies, like deferring grid upgrades. Those are incredibly important, of course. It's a fundamental part of getting these things onto the grid. But it seemed to be, a lot of the conversation seemed to be missing the point of why we've been doing this in the first place, which again is often motivated by environmental and health reasons. So we set out to develop an approach to try to value and realize some of these potential co-benefits that come with the integration of these many emerging technologies onto the grid. So a little bit of background, which most of you are probably familiar with. Power plants have a wide variety of environmental and health impacts. Here we were looking specifically at air quality impacts. Power plants emit carbon dioxide, criteria pollutants like particulate matter, NOx and SOx, and toxic and hazardous air pollutants. Criteria pollutants in particular can contribute to the formation of ozone and particulate matter, which have broad regional impacts. And the health impacts of these pollutants include such things as asthma exacerbations, increased risk of respiratory infections, premature death in some cases, and particularly affect the elderly, those with underlying heart and lung disease, young children, and other vulnerable populations. Another note here is that power plants often tend to be disproportionately located in communities of low socioeconomic status and that have a high cumulative burden of multiple social and economic and environmental stressors. These we often refer to as environmental justice communities. And these communities not only have this disproportionate share of environmental and social burdens, but as a result are also more vulnerable to the impact of many environmental stressors. So current policies to try to mitigate some of the impacts of power plant emissions, I tend to think about in two categories. The first category is emission limits. We have technology standards on, let's say, power plants. So your power plant is only allowed to emit a certain amount of NOx per megawatt hour when you start it up, only a certain amount when it's running. So there are limits on how much that they can emit. We have cap and trade. In California, we have AB 32, which controls carbon emissions, and so there's a cap on carbon emissions, and you can trade those. We also do this with SOx and NOx, and so criteria pollutants are capped and traded, including within air basins, to reduce the total criteria pollutant emissions. And finally, there are options like emission taxes and fees. Alternatively, you have the other side, which are clean energy targets. So we have renewable portfolio standards across the country. California has a new energy storage target, which other states are starting to look into. There are things like rooftop solar incentives. And so all these are sort of like positive ways to integrate new clean energy technologies. But we sort of saw that there was a missing gap where we have a lot of clean energy targets and things coming on the grid that have the potential to reduce all of those emissions, but they're not being integrated in a way that really actively does so. It's more that, oh, if it happens to displace something, that's great. So we wanted to think about how you could actively realize the co-benefits of many of these technologies. Basically, can we add energy storage or distributed solar or demand response to the grid? Where? and operate it when it will have the greatest environmental and health co-benefits. So we came up with a framework of metrics to try to value emission reductions, the emission reductions that you would get from integrating a specific technology that could operate at a time and place on the grid. The first metric is the most common that everyone uses already, the total mass of emissions. We did not focus on this metric as much here because, as we noted earlier, the total mass is captured in a number of existing policy mechanisms, like cap and trade. So instead, we looked specifically at the rate of emissions, so that's tons per megawatt hour. If you displace, let's say, in our case, we're looking at peaking power plants with a high rate of emissions per megawatt hour with, a megawatt hour of solar, that's where you're going to get the most sort of bang for your buck in terms of emission reductions. And so rate is important when you're thinking about your individual, megawatt hour of new technology here or there. And then finally, the two things that people don't seem to think about as much, which are the time of emissions and location of emissions. And so by this, we looked specifically at background air quality, and particularly the operation of power plants on poor air quality days, and the location of emissions, both in terms of regional air quality, as well as the siting of these power plants near the vulnerable communities that we mentioned earlier. The overarching goal would be to do something like dispatching demand response on poor air quality days to reduce emissions from your most polluting power plants near disadvantaged and vulnerable communities. So how do we actually apply these metrics? Basically, we take our set of 4 metrics and apply them to historic or modeled future grid emissions to identify what we consider the highest impact marginal emissions on the grid, and then try to reduce those high impact marginal emissions through siting and dispatch of clean technologies. So again, we look at our historical emissions in a specific area, look at the rate of emissions in terms of tons per megawatt hour, or grams per megawatt hour, whatever your unit is, the location, what's the background air quality, who's living nearby, population density, and then the time of emissions. We only looked at the background air quality, but this could be included with additional sort of atmospheric modeling of what the likely impact of those emissions are on ozone and particulate matter formation. So once you've identified what your high impact marginal emissions are on the grid, this can then feed into your siting protocol. So as, let's say, the Utilities Commission are coming up with their long-term procurement plans and considering a few different options, modeling what the expected impact is going to be on grid emissions, not just in terms of total emissions, but also when and where those emissions will take place. And then that can feed into your dispatch protocol. So if you're projecting there will be a high demand day and poor air quality, now that you've cited those technologies in the correct region, you can call on them to displace your high impact marginal emissions. So as a case study, we look specifically at peaker power plants in California. In California, peaker plants are not the source of the bulk of emissions. Power plants in general are actually not the source of the bulk of emissions, of criteria pollutant emissions in California. They tend to be transportation. But within the power sector, they emit pollutants at a much higher rate per megawatt hour than natural gas combined cycle plants. So we'll get more into this as we go on, but again, these plants are emitting 30% more carbon dioxide per megawatt hour and nearly 4 times as much NOx per megawatt hour as natural gas combined cycle plants. Furthermore, and we'll go a little bit more into this, 84% of them are located in areas considered more vulnerable than the median using our environmental justice screening tool, Cal-Enviro-Screen. So again, we sort of skipped over the total emissions at this juncture and are looking specifically at rate and location and focused on peaker power plants as our case study. To dive a little bit more specifically into rate, of the power plants on the California grid, we've mapped them in 4 different classes here: natural gas combined cycle, cogeneration plants, aging gas steam plants, and peaker plants. We plotted them according to the NOx emission rate on the bottom axis here. Note that that's a log scale, so every sort of bar you go over to the right, you're up by a factor of 10. And on a sort of regular scale on the vertical axis, we have carbon dioxide emissions per megawatt hour. What you'll see is the natural gas combined cycle plants are tend to have the lowest rate of emissions on the grid. Cogen plants are sort of all over the place. What we're not capturing here is the heat value of these plants. They often produce some heat at the same time, or warm water that is not captured. So we didn't focus on those specifically because they're not entirely comparable. The aging gas steam plants in California have the highest CO2 emission rates, but slightly lower NOx rates on average than the peakers. These plants, however, are being actively phased out in California. So instead we focused on our peaker power plants, which are the highest NOx rates per megawatt hour and relatively high CO2 rates per megawatt hour. So once we've looked specifically we've selected our peaker power plants as being the highest rate emitters on the grid that we would like to displace in terms of marginal emissions. We look at the sort of time, and in this case, part of the location of those emissions. To get a sense of where you might have high impacts on a sort of like temporal scale, we came up with a new metric where we looked specifically at what % of the time the plant is generating electricity on days that local or air basin air quality exceeds the EPA's National Ambient Air Quality Standards for ozone or particulate matter concentrations. There are negative impacts to having poor air quality that is even below these standards, but we looked at this metric to have sort of a simple gauge of how frequently these plants operate, basically in bad air quality areas and on bad air quality days. As an example, I have a power plant here in the South Coast Air Basin, and this is operational data for the month of September 2014. The blue bars are any time that the power plant was operating, and the red and black bars are measures of when 8-hour ozone was exceeded, either at the closest air monitor or within that air basin. And you'll see that there are a significant number of days that this power plant is operating when ozone standards are exceeded in the area, when the acute ozone standards are being exceeded. So again, we just did a metric where we divided the number of megawatt hours on days exceeding standards by the total number of the total amount of generation to get a simple metric of how often these things operate on poor air quality days. Here we look specifically at what this looks like for the peaker power plants in California. On the bottom axis, we have the % of electricity generated on days that exceeded air quality standards. And on the vertical axis, we have the total number of days in that area that exceeded poor air quality standards. You'll notice that in California specifically, the power plants tend to disproportionately generate electricity on poor ozone days, but not necessarily on poor particulate matter days, which we believe has to do with the fact that poor particulate matter days occur here in the winter when demand is somewhat lower, but in the summer when ozone tends to exceed standards is when everyone's turning on their air conditioning and demand spikes, and that's when everyone turns on all their peaker power plants. There are a handful of plants here that are generating more than, that are generating a quarter to a third of their electricity on days that are exceeding standards, which is kind of crazy. So now that we've sort of filtered for that, we look specifically at additional locational metrics. And for this, we brought in a set of environmental justice screening tools. If you aren't familiar with these, there's a tool in California called Cal EnviroScreen. The EPA has one called EJ Screen. The links to both of them are on the bottom right. What these are tools that integrate demographic and environmental burden indicators to try to come up with a cumulative score of burdens and potential vulnerabilities of populations, and then rank those for different census tracts throughout the state. The specific metrics that are being considered are things like economic level, educational levels, linguistic isolation, environmental burdens like water pollution and air pollution, and proximity to hazardous facilities, proximity to Superfund sites, and so on. There's no sort of, again, there's no like specific set of metrics you should or shouldn't use. There are different combinations that each of these tools use. And when looking at who's actually living near a power plant, there's no specific number. You're not going to have higher impacts at 1.1 miles than you do at 1.2 miles per se. Your air quality impacts are broad and stretch over a really large area. However, there have been a number of initial studies that have shown that living next to power plants is associated with poor health outcomes like low birth weights and increased hospital visits. In California, historically, when they've been citing power plants, they have considered demographic information like percent of minority population living within 6 miles of power plants. The EPA, within its Clean Power Plan, did an analysis of the demographics of populations living within 3 miles of all of its power plants. Because we were looking specifically at California, we used the Cal EnviroScreen tool, which came out of the Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment from the state, and assessed populations living within 6 miles of each of the peaker power plants in question. So we then combined the environmental justice metrics with the air quality metrics that we looked at earlier. Each of these blue circles here is a power plant. The circle size corresponds with population density living around, so larger circles means you're in more of a dense urban area. On the bottom axis, we have the percent of generation on days that exceed air quality standards. And on the left, we have the Cal EnviroScreen score. So as you go up on your left axis, you're getting to populations that are considered more vulnerable or experience more cumulative environmental and socioeconomic burdens. There are a couple of plants here that really stand out. Those are down in Southern California that have particularly high Cal EnviroScreen scores. These are located in particularly vulnerable communities, and more than a third of their generation is on days that is exceeding air quality standards in the area. So basically what this does is this is serving as a screen. We have screened for our high rate emitters by looking at the peaking power plants. And then we've looked at the sort of temporal and locational metrics to figure out which sort of power plants are having your highest impact marginal emissions. And these are areas where if we cite technologies in the same substation footprint, you have the opportunity to displace those highest impact marginal emissions. So what technologies are we actually looking at to do so? We looked at 4 specific technology combinations, although there are other options as well. We looked at demand response and considered that it would displace demand to just a lower, to a sort of average grid mix of 60% natural gas combined cycle, 40% renewables, or renewables, hydro, nuclear in California, no carbon technologies. And then similarly, energy storage charged with approximately 60% natural gas combined cycle or 100% natural gas combined cycle. And finally, on-site renewables and efficiency. And these bars on the top look at the displaced carbon dioxide emissions, and on the bottom, the displaced NOx emissions from each of these technology sets. what we'll see is that the range bar represents the 5th to 95th percentile of California peaker plant emission rates. You'll notice that there's a really broad range of emissions for NOx, which means that targeting those plants that are far out there on the really high rate of NOx emissions, again, you're going to get the highest bang for your buck in terms of emission displacement. What we'll see, of course, is that if you can actively displace those emissions with on-site renewables and efficiency, that's where you are going to get your greatest emission reductions. However, while you can sort of target those to displace specific marginal emissions, let's say you know that you have peak generation typically in the afternoon and you could tilt all of your solar panels, let's say, facing towards the west so that they're more likely to generate later in the day and correspond to peak and displace some of those marginal emissions. You can't control it the same way as demand response and energy storage. So storage and demand response have some emissions still associated with them unless you charge them only with renewables, but you can actively dispatch and choose when to select those technologies in lieu of your high marginal impact emitters. So this is we did a sort of simple version of this framework. Again, we looked specifically at one class of power plants in California. But if this framework were to extend to full power sector planning, it would require doing power sector modeling across all of the plants in an area as opposed to just an individual subset, which we did here. We also only analyzed the emissions, but you can get much more nuance in terms of the actual impact of these plants by considering atmospheric conditions and doing air quality dispersion modeling as well to figure out if some areas are more likely, or at certain times you are more likely to get ozone and particulate matter formation from these emissions. Again, our proxy for this was looking at 4 air quality days, but doing full modeling will get you much more nuance in that area. We also looked, again, just at peaking power plants and individual plants, but we noticed that in some cases these plants are located near a few plants in the same area. When your peaker power plants come on, it actually probably means that most of the power plants across the grid are coming on because they're usually the last plants that are called on. I don't think I even said what peaker power plants are actually at the beginning of this entire conversation, so I should probably jump back to that. The peaker power plants in California are the ones that come on for probably 5 to 10% of the time. They meet peak demand. They tend to be lower efficiency than your other plants, but they can ramp on and off quickly. And so they come on a small percent of the year that are less efficient and have more emissions. So again, when those plants come on, it probably means that all of your other plants that are in the area come on. And so there may be potential that you're going to have a few plants all in the same place that may be contributing to some kind of, let's say, local pollution hotspots or something like that. And so it would be important to look not just at those individual emissions, but what that sort of combined emissions and impacts are going to be. We also only looked at the displaced emissions, but we, of course, would have to consider the location of the emissions from whichever plants are being used to actually charge, let's say, your energy storage, or are serving the load displaced by demand response. And there may be additional benefits from also addressing chronic air quality impacts. We specifically looked at acute impacts here for emissions from the peaker power plants in California. But if you're looking at, let's say, your sort of chronic PM emissions, even low levels of PM from your coal plants are going to have negative health impacts. And so that should be a consideration as well. So if we're actually applying this framework, what does this look like? In California, there's potential for storage or demand response, as we saw, to be sited or dispatched in the same substation footprint as peakers with high marginal emission rates, and those that, again, operate a lot on poor air quality days. Outside of California, there actually may be an even higher benefit to employing this strategy. You have a lot of coal and oil emissions, you have SOx emissions and particulate matter emissions. California has a relatively clean grid. In other places, again, your bang for your buck per megawatt hour is going to be even higher from integrating clean technologies to actively displace those emissions. However, they may take place at a different time. Coal serves usually a very different need on the load than peaking power plants. And so you might need something like a suite of solar plus storage technologies that are actively displacing coal rather than demand response to displaced peakers. An example of this actually that came out last year, there was a study from Georgia Tech that did atmospheric modeling and showed that if you dispatch natural gas in lieu of coal plants in Georgia, based on atmospheric conditions, at times when particulate matter formation was expected to be most rapid, you could have sort of outsized public health benefits. The sort of natural conclusion of this, of course, is that emerging energy resources could achieve similar or even greater benefits with lower emissions than natural gas. But they, and I think there have been a couple of studies in the New York region as well, have demonstrated from an atmospheric modeling standpoint that this is feasible. An important caveat here, however, is that storage could also have a negative impact. If you are charging your storage with coal generation to displace natural gas peaker power plants, there's a chance that you are going to have a high impact on marginal emissions and actually have a negative impact on local air quality. So you have to be careful about which marginal emissions are being displaced and where and when you are shifting your demand. In terms of general policy applications, how you could actually use this, the very first thing to do is just to require measurement and reporting of emission impacts from all of the new technologies coming on the grid. This is something that we have seen missing in a lot of the sort of solar targets, storage targets, demonstration projects, long-term procurement modeling, is just a measurement and reporting of what your emission impacts are and when those emissions are taking place. And of course, that can be combined with modeling of air quality impacts. It's very hard to optimize or improve a system if you don't know what's there in the first place. So sort of the simplest and easiest thing is that as we start to increase our incorporation of these technologies on the grid, just start making sure we measure what our baseline emission benefits are. The next step, of course, is then to prioritize clean and emerging energy technologies in lieu of new fossil-fired peaker plants in long-term procurement planning and siting, if you're comparing a few different siting scenarios, particularly an area that rank high on our metrics. As an example, California had a preferred resources pilot when it was replacing the San Onofre nuclear generating station in California. That's a nuclear power plant that came offline recently. And to replace that, they have a set aside for clean energy technologies. And so similarly, you could require preferred resources in areas that you expect might be high impact in terms of emissions. And then, of course, prioritize the dispatch of them for loading order. Extending the dispatch conversation, I think it would also make a huge amount of sense to use environmental conditions to dispatch storage or demand response. In California, again, we have something called spare the air days. Those are days that we know we are going to have bad ozone or particulate matter concentrations, and we are told we should try not to drive our cars, we should not light bonfires. It sort of makes sense that on those days, maybe we should try not to fire up our power plants either. And so we can integrate environmental conditions into those specific dispatch algorithms. Next component would be investing cap and trade funding in emerging technologies that benefit vulnerable communities, both directly, again, we're looking at solar can defray bills and so on, but also indirectly through displacing emissions that impact those communities. And then we can also think a little bit more about how we price criteria pollutants. Right now we have trading mechanisms throughout throughout California for things like NOx and SOx. but those can be traded across basins. They can be banked up over years, and so having sort of more specific time and place constraints or prices on those it could also sort of tip the favor in terms of deploying clean energy technologies instead. What does this look like in terms of example policy applications, things that are on the table right now? I mentioned cap and trade funding. One of the policies in California is to take money from the carbon dioxide cap and trade and invest that again in to the benefit of disadvantaged communities. So that would be one potential application in this case. Another is integrating, again, starting with measurement, but integrating it into things like the locational net benefit analysis taking place at the California Public Utility Commission. There's a conversation about how do we value the location of solar on the grid, of storage on the grid. But again, the sort of environmental and health benefits or equity benefits are largely missing from the conversation. And so trying to first measure and then second put some kind of value onto those is important. A similar thing is happening right now in New York State under reforming the energy vision, where there is a large effort underway to try to create a market for distributed energy resources. They've started conversations about the social cost of carbon, and there's been some sort of side mention of criteria pollutants and so on. But there's huge potential as you're trying to come up with, again, these sort of nuanced valuations of where and when different technologies coming onto the grid provide certain benefits, of analyzing what the emission impacts of those technologies are at the same time. The Clean Power Plan, as a part of that, has a clean energy incentive program which incentivizes states to invest in efficiency, and I think there's potential for renewables as well early in order to benefit low-income and minority communities. And so, of course, you would have even greater benefits and greater benefit to those vulnerable communities if those programs are designed in such a way that you incorporate some of these potential co-benefits. The Clean Power Plan also suggests that states take a sort of multi-pollutant approach to emission reductions. So there is some precedent there, I can't say that word, in order to try to support the adoption of technologies that are going to have an impact not just on carbon, but on other pollutants as well. Finally, something that came up recently in California is that you guys have probably all heard there was a big gas leak in Aliso Canyon, a natural gas storage facility down south, and there's been an effort to try to replace some of the demand for that gas with energy storage. So when you have things like those specific targets, there's an opportunity to try to get, a few co-benefits at the same time. So you're integrating specific targets onto the grid. Let's not just use it for meeting this individual demand, but try to get some of the potential emission reduction co-benefits in a very targeted way. So I think that's it. That leaves us about 15 minutes for questions. Again, we sort of introduced a set of 4 metrics, total rate, location, and time of emissions. And we think that by applying those metrics to historic emissions, there's an opportunity to identify what your highest impact marginal emissions are, and then to integrate clean energy technologies like energy storage, demand response, solar onto the grid in a way that prioritize the deployment of those technologies so that they will displace our highest impact marginal emissions, and then take that to the next level and actively dispatch clean energy technologies and incorporate it into the sort of dispatch mechanisms. so that we can have the greatest co-benefits coming out of all these great new technologies coming onto the grid. And that's it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Elena. That was really a great presentation, very comprehensive, and thanks for the introduction, Seth. So I'm happy to help with the title of your next journal article.
I know,
although
right? I'm an engineer, and we're not great at this.
I've been accused of overly long titles too, though, so actually we might want to bring Sam back in. She's better at making brief titles. But let's get to questions. We have a number of very good questions. I commend our attendees today. There's some really good stuff in here. Just to start off, first there's a question, is there any publicly available a free version of this case study, a synopsis or a policy version that people can get access to?
We have not written up a short version. This presentation should be available, but please email me. My email was on the last slide. And if you have a recommendation for whether it'd be helpful to have a 2-pager or 1-pager, or what would be most useful for you, let me know, and we will put that together, because that's important.
Yeah, I think a lot of people would really benefit from that. So I second that motion. So
yes, but again, we want it to be useful for you. So please email me with what you would want, so that we can make it in the sort of most accessible format.
Great. So here's an interesting question. Wondering if you guys have studied the comparative opportunities and possible advantages of working with community choice aggregation, community choice energy programs versus working with investor-owned utilities in order to minimize pollutants and maximize public health.
We haven't looked at it specifically. I think that there is a decent amount of potential there, simply because you have smaller organizations that are often formed directly for environmental reasons. At least in California, all of the community choice aggregation programs are in place because people want higher penetrations of renewables, they want local renewables, and so there's a will there that I think might be more difficult when you're dealing with utilities that are beholden to shareholders. So I think that's a great idea and opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have any comments on quick start reciprocating internal combustion engine generators that are being promoted by some as complementary technology to high percentage renewable portfolios as an alternative to gas turbines?
I am unfortunately afraid that that is beyond my scope. I do know that when we looked specifically at a lot of the peaker power plants, that they have very high emission rates in their first hours and minutes of operation. So if we are switching over to have higher penetration of renewables, and these things are coming on quickly and have lots of ramping, especially from start, that you might have even higher emissions. And so I think that's an important consideration. And so if you have another technology that can reduce that, that's great. I also think storage is great. And there have been a few cases where they've started trying to couple storage with siting a few power plants to try to minimize some of that ramping and so on.
Yeah, I would say that in general, internal combustion engines are pretty high polluting as well. Don't tend to be a good technology choice. There are, things like combined heat and power. If they have a quick ramping ability, they could potentially be a better alternative to peaker plants from, just from what I've seen, because they're more efficient since they use the heat energy as well. But interestingly, California recently proposed not allowing backup generators, which tend to be, this internal combustion engine, to participate in demand response programs because of the high emissions, and they didn't fit in with the state's greenhouse gas reduction goals. So.
Right, and a lot of those generators are also maybe have like lower stacks, are in more urban areas, and have higher pollutant emission rates.
Yeah,
another thing that also came up that was interesting during some of our conversations after this paper came out is that a number of the power plants also have their own backup diesel generators themselves that they test on a regular basis to ensure that they can operate in case they need to get the plant on in the case of some kind of black start. And so one opportunity would be to ensure that those backup diesel generators, when people are testing them either at power plants and other cases, that those are not operated, again, on poor air quality days or on times when they're expected to have the highest impact on air quality.
Yeah, great. So related to question, I think this probably, we maybe already touched on this, but when you're considering demand response in the results that you showed, you're talking just about a facility reducing their demand from the grid and not by running a diesel generator in the background.
Yes, I'm talking explicitly about demand response and people reducing their demand and shifting it to another time. There have been some initial studies that suggest that demand response does reduce total load by a few percent as well, that not all of that load gets shifted. Some of it just seems to disappear. But we considered that all of that load was just shifted to an off-peak time.
Gotcha. So in your look at displaced emissions, there was a question about some of the other impacts from storage and PV manufacturing, transportation, et cetera. I know these occur most likely at different locations, so not within the communities we're looking at here, but were they factored into your analysis at all, or do you have any insight on how those emissions impacts globally compare to the emissions from the plants that you studied?
No, those were not incorporated into our study. I think that that is incredibly important to consider. Everything from mining materials for, electrodes and batteries to the energy input for PV fabrication. That was not incorporated into this analysis, however, and I think has to be tackled sort of in a supply chain standpoint. Ideally, it would be awesome if you could analyze the entire grid and all of the inputs at the same time, but that was beyond our scope here.
Yeah, that's pretty involved. So yeah, to elaborate on that too, then you should consider all the extraction emissions that come from extracting natural gas or coal, whatever the peaker plant fuel source is coming from. Yeah.
We didn't take into account upstream emissions from natural gas either.
So in your analysis that showed the disadvantaged communities and the high rate emitter peaker power plants, it looked like the worst ones were focused in Southern California. Did you come across some high rate peaker plants in Northern California as well?
I think there were a handful, but there was certainly the ones with high impacts tend to be located in Southern California from our standpoint. I think that there were high rate emitters scattered throughout the state, but in terms of the ones that tend to generate electricity on poor air quality days, they were often located in Southern California because there's poor air quality in Southern California.
Yeah, no, that makes sense with yeah, go ahead.
Also in terms of load, there's much higher load in San Francisco, LA, and San Diego. So if you look at a map of California, San Francisco is actually not that far north. It's pretty far down the coast. And so when you're meeting San Francisco, San Jose, and so on, all of the plants in general are sort of more in that direction to meet the demand.
Gotcha. Yeah, I can certainly see, particularly in the Los Angeles area, the basin there in the valley, that the poor air quality days are probably a lot higher there than they are in some of the more northern regions.
Right. I live in Oakland, and actually our air quality is relatively good comparatively.
Yeah. So here's a question that someone had fundamentally on the study. Is your focus more on the siting and scoping of energy storage facility kind of on the planning and capital investment side, or more on the strategy for how they'll be dispatch of hypothetically existing storage, which seems like really you're focused on both of those, but yeah, I'd like to get your thoughts on that.
So the thing is, I think theoretically there may be some opportunities to do dispatch today. I don't think that there just isn't that much storage yet. We sort of wanted to hit this as it starts to grow so that we integrate it in the best possible way. And so there is an opportunity, certainly, to try to dispatch demand response in Southern California, which is something that some areas are trying out. But we specifically thought about it starting with the siting side, because if you site it in the places where it is most likely to be helpful moving forward, then you'll have the technology there to call on to dispatch when you need it.
Great. Let's see. Well, honestly, I think that we've pretty well covered most of the major questions that have come in. I encourage anyone that has remaining questions to reach out to us here or to reach out to Elena and Seth directly. We're also happy to connect you if you don't have their information written down yet. And really appreciate everybody that came out today, and thank you very much to Elena and Seth for presenting on this really interesting topic. We encourage you to go ahead and look at our website for any upcoming webinars. And Sam, do you have any final thoughts?
Thanks, Seth. So we have frequent webinars. We hope that you'll join us for some of those. As Seth said, you can find out information on those on our website at resilient-power.org. And we also encourage you to look us up on Facebook and on Twitter. We post a lot of news there as well. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Thank you guys very much for having us. And again, please, for all the audience, don't hesitate to email if you have any questions. We would love to talk further.